Hey everybody, welcome back to the Financial Freedom Show. My name is Rob Berger. Today we're going to talk about Social Security and some claiming strategies. This is based on an article that I came across last week. I actually included it in last Sunday's newsletter. If you're not a subscriber, you can sign up to the newsletter below with the link below this video. It's free. I send it out every Sunday morning. But in any event, I included an article in that newsletter. I will link to it, and I'm going to show it to you in a minute, but I'll link to it below this video as well. And it walks through a claiming strategy for Social Security, and I want to share it with you today in today's video because I think it can be very, very helpful. The difficulty often with figuring out, when should I claim Social Security if you're married, the spouse and the higher earner and the lower earner, and when should they each claim, and how should we sort of think through all of that? One of the big challenges, of course, is we don't know how long we're going to live, at least in most cases. And so, if we knew how long we were going to live, then the answer would be pretty straightforward and pretty easy, but we don't. And so we have to figure out a way sort of around that. So what we're going to do in today's video is walk through sort of the three overarching strategies. I put them in three different categories, sort of the ways to think about what might be the best approach for you. And then for one of them in particular, we're going to look through, I guess I'd call it a framework that I think can help you sort of think through these issues. So let's dive right in. So let's start with those sort of three high-level strategies. The first is simply you want to start claiming Social Security as soon as you can, either because you have to, you just need it, for budgetary reasons, you need the money, or maybe you're a little concerned about the future of Social Security and that sort of thing, and you just say, Rob, I want my money as soon as I can get it. And that's probably the easiest of the three strategies to think through, because you're either going to get it at 62, that's the earliest you can claim Social Security. And by the way, there are always exceptions to depending on different circumstances, but 62 when you can claim Social Security, and or maybe as soon as you retire, maybe you're going to work until you're 63 or 65 or whatever, and your plan is simply, Rob, as soon as I retire, I'm claiming my Social Security. So that's one strategy. And I guess it's the easiest, right? You don't need a calculator. You don't need to try to figure out mortality tables or all these other things. So that's sort of strategy one. And by the way, it turns out that just from a pure numbers perspective, that's more or less the strategy that most people take. However, I don't think it's always the best strategy, at least if financially you can hold off. And so that gets us to the other two strategies. The second one is, since we don't know how long we're going to live, is to sort of use mortality tables and try to make estimates of, if we live this long and then if we live that long, and what's the sort of present value of all of these future Social Security payments that we might receive depending on when we started receiving Social Security, and kind of coming up with sort of a present value of those future payments just using standard mortality tables. Now you may say, well, Rob, yeah, I get that, but that's awfully complicated to figure out. Yes, it is, but fortunately we have a free tool that can help us, and I've talked about it in the past. It's called Open Social Security. I know the person, Mike Piper, created this. Many of you know Mike, or have heard of him or read his work. He was a guest on the show, I guess earlier this year, and I'll link to that interview below this video where we talk at some length about this free tool. But this is a fairly easy to use tool that can help you figure out whether you're single, divorced, widowed, married, what your claiming strategy should be if your goal is to try to, one, maximize the sort of the lifetime value of your benefits, keeping in mind that we don't generally know how long we have to live. So that's sort of strategy number two, and a free tool to help you figure that out. Now, strategy number three, and this is where we're going to spend a little more time today, is where we say, we want to use Social Security almost as insurance in the event that we live much longer than, say, the mortality tables would suggest. So maybe you live into your 90s or maybe even older, and if you're married, maybe your spouse, or at least one of you, lives well past, say, the average age, or maybe you both do. And then in that case, at first glance, we might say, well, maybe we should just both wait until we're 70 if we're married. Does it matter if I'm widowed or divorced? How should we think about that? And that's where this framework comes in. And I get this from this article that as I said, I linked to this in the newsletter last week, and I will link to it below this video. This comes from Can I Retire Yet? And it was written, actually, I know Chris, I've known Chris for a number of years, and he's part of a financial planning firm. And what they share in this article is sort of their framework for thinking through when to claim Social Security if your goal is that sort of longevity insurance. Now, before we walk through their framework, and I'll put it back up on the screen, one thing I will say is there are tools that can help you with these calculations as well. Certainly New Retirement, which is the retirement planning tool I use, has a tool. In fact, I can just briefly show it to you. I won't go into it in detail, but this is what their tool looks like, their Explorer. You can change assumptions about when you're going to claim, your longevity assumptions. You can have one spouse living much longer than the other. You can create scenarios. But there are other tools as well. Maxify is one that I think is highly regarded that does a really in-depth Social Security analysis. So these tools are helpful. But the thing I like about the framework that I'm going to show you in the article that I'll link to is that I think it's helpful, even if you're going to use some of these tools, to sort of understand the rationale behind it. And I think the framework does a great job. So I'll put it up on the screen as I walk through it. Let me see if I can make it maybe a little bit bigger. There we go. And so this goes, they actually come up with they categorize the strategies, 4 different ones. I kind of combined 2 and 3, but the one we're sort of focused on is late life monthly income. I kind of think of it as longevity insurance. What happens if you live to be 100? And where it starts here, and you can read this for yourself, but we're going to skip down to this right here. They actually have let me get to it here, the decision tree. And I found this very useful. Now, again, I would use this as a guideline, right? This is a sort of a high-level guideline. It's not set in stone. There's no one single right answer. I want to stress that. But they walk through it. And the first one is never married. And that's important. It's not single, right? Because we're going to look at divorced and widowed in a minute. This is someone who's never been married. And you want money, in case you live much longer than the mortality table suggests. So their framework says, well, you'll wait until you're 70. That's the age where you can maximize your Social Security benefits. Of course, they point out this doesn't apply if you can't afford to wait, sure. And I suppose if you had health issues and you thought it was unlikely, in their view, that you would live past 75, you could actually do a break-even analysis. But this was sort of their rule of thumb. If you've never been married, and you want that longevity insurance, don't claim until you're 70 unless you can't afford to wait or you have a strong belief you won't live past the age of 75. That's a fairly easy scenario. It gets much more complicated when you're married. So now we've got a couple, and we have to think about this in terms of the one that had the higher earnings and therefore the larger Social Security benefit, and then the one with the lower earnings. And so if you're the higher earner, wait until 70, right? And again, there could be some life expectancy issues, but wait until 70, even if you don't expect to live long. And it says, for the sake of the widow. And so here's the idea, and this is what my wife and I are doing. So I'm the higher earner, so I plan to wait until I'm 70. And the idea is, remember, if I die first, my wife would get either her benefit or mine, whichever is higher. Well, mine's going to be the higher. And so I'm waiting until 70 in large part to protect her in case I, die first. She'll get that larger payout. Now, if she passes away first, I'll just still get my higher payout. You don't get to keep both, but that's sort of the idea behind it. And so that's the higher earner. That's actually the easier of the two. Now we get to the lower earner. Should they wait till they're 70? Because that would maximize the amount of money they would receive. But often the answer is no, and it's a little more complicated. And let's take a look. One of the things they say right here is that you can use Mike Piper's, and this is the open Social Security tool that we looked at, to determine the claiming strategy for the lower earner if, again, you want to try to maximize the lifetime value of their benefits, not knowing what their longevity is going to be. And if you take that approach, you're sort of combining two strategies, right? You're using the wait as long as possible longevity insurance strategy for the higher earner, but for the lower earner, it's more of that Mike Piper open Social Security, try to maximize the present value of the benefits, not knowing what your longevity will be. So you're using a combination of those two strategies. And I think that's very reasonable, but it's not the only approach. And so they walk through here. So what they say is, and this is where we have to remember, there's also a spousal benefit that you can get. It again depends on the numbers and whether it makes sense to take the spousal benefit or your own benefit. Sometimes you take a combination of the two, but you can never get more than the spousal benefit, assuming it's larger. But what they say is, look, if the spousal benefit is larger than your own, then start getting the spousal benefit at 67. And I think what they mean is full retirement age, and that can vary a little bit depending on when you were born. But the idea there is that if you take the spousal benefit sooner than that, sooner than full retirement age, you won't get as much. And then they say you can take your own benefit at 67 even if your spousal benefit's larger, but because your spouse hasn't filed yet, right? So that would be a limitation on the spousal benefit. And then they say if you take your own at 70, if your own benefit is larger than your spousal benefit. So there are three scenarios. It can be a little mind-numbing, so just work through that. But that's, again, a high-level framework with dealing with the lower earning spouse. So a little more complicated, but there's sort of a logic to it, and hopefully you find that helpful. And then they've got for divorced and widowed, and divorced if ex-spouse is still alive, otherwise use widowed. And they say take your spousal at 67 if you qualify and the spousal is larger. And otherwise, you would wait until 70 if you don't qualify, or your own benefit would be larger. And again, remember, this is when you're focused on longevity insurance. You want to protect against, what happens if I lived into my 90s or 100. So I just want to keep stressing that. They're not saying that this is the best approach in any and all circumstances. Remember, there were three different strategies we talked about at the start of the video. We're assuming the strategy we're focused on is longevity insurance. So that's their approach if you're divorced. And then if you're widowed, you have a survivor benefit. So survivor at 60 if the survivor benefit is smaller, and then you can add your own to that at age 70. And then it's interesting. They say take your own at 62 if it's smaller, then add survivor at 67. Now, I will be honest, I've never had to deal with this before, and so I'm by no means I don't consider myself an expert in Social Security generally, although I have a reasonable understanding, but I'm certainly out of my element there when it comes to widowed and survivor benefits. But that's their framework if that is your situation. So I wanted to walk through that. I think it's at least useful in understanding sort of the logic behind some of these decisions, even if you either use one of the tools I showed you or some other tool to help you, or you hire someone to do the Social Security analysis for you. I think having sort of the knowledge of these sorts of frameworks so you can understand the issues at play, keeping in mind that there is no one right answer to this. It's almost always a series of trade-offs and what's most important to you. So hopefully you found this helpful. Again, I'll link to everything below this video. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I'll be happy to help you out any way I can. Until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.